August 18th, 1966. American generals stood before President Nixon, claiming credit for a brilliant tactical victory in Vietnam that proved their strategy was working. But when Nixon heard the truth about who really won the Battle of Long Tan, his response exposed the lie at the heart of the entire American war effort. What did Nixon say that made those generals go silent? And why did this single battle prove we were fighting the war completely wrong? This is the battle American generals would later try to claim as proof their tactics worked, until Nixon heard what really happened and said something that made them all go quiet. August 18th, 1966. Long Tan Rubber Plantation, Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. The rain came down in sheets that morning. Not normal rain, but the kind that turns the world grey and makes you wonder if the sky will ever stop pouring. D Company of the 6th Battalion. Royal Australian Regiment walked through rows of rubber trees outside their base at Nui Dat. Water ran down their helmets, soaked through their uniforms, filled their boots. The red dirt under their feet turned to thick mud that grabbed at every step. Major Harry Smith led 108 men into that plantation. Most of them were young. Many had never seen combat before. Some were conscripts, just regular guys pulled into the army who 3 months ago were working normal jobs back in Australia. Now they carried SLR rifles that weighed 9 pounds empty, plus packs that weighed 60 pounds more. The M60 machine gun teams hauled their weapons with 2 men, sharing the load of the gun and the heavy belts of ammunition. The rubber trees stood in perfect rows like soldiers themselves. French colonists had planted them decades before in neat lines, each tree exactly the same distance from the next. Between the rows, you could see maybe 50 meters on a clear day. In this rain, visibility dropped to 30 meters, maybe less. The temperature had been 95 degrees that morning, hot enough to cook you inside your gear. When the monsoon hit, it dropped 20 degrees in minutes. Steam rose from the ground where cold rain met hot earth. Intelligence said there might be scattered enemy fighters in the area, small groups, nothing serious. The night before, some mortars had hit near the base. D Company was doing a routine patrol to check it out, find the mortar position, maybe chase off a few guerrillas, then come home. They expected to be back by dinner. Some of the younger soldiers joked about it. Quick walk in the rain, fire a few shots, mission complete. Intelligence was wrong, catastrophically wrong. Moving through the plantation, the soldiers spread out in standard formation, 3 platoons, each with about 30 men. They moved carefully, weapons ready, eyes scanning the rubber trees. Radio operators carried heavy sets on their backs, antennas bobbing as they walked. The rain pounded so hard it drowned out radio chatter. Static hissed in the headsets. Communications were breaking down before the battle even started. The platoon commanders were young men given enormous responsibility. Dave Sabin was 21 years old, barely older than some of the men he led. He had trained hard, learned his job well, but training never fully prepares you for the real thing. He walked with his platoon, checking spacing, making sure his men stayed alert despite the miserable weather. His uniform was already soaked through, water dripped from his chin. His boots made sucking sounds in the mud with every step. What they didn't know was that the 275th Regiment of the Viet Cong was staging in that plantation. Not 30 men, not even 300. Try 2,000, maybe more. An entire regiment of trained fighters, reinforced by the D445 Provincial Battalion and soldiers from North Vietnam itself. These weren't scattered guerrillas hiding in the jungle. This was an army preparing to attack the Australian base where 1,000 men slept. The enemy had planned this for weeks. They studied the Australian patrols. They knew the routes. They knew the timing. They watched the base defenses looking for weak points. They counted soldiers. They measured distances. They prepared their weapons and stockpiled ammunition. Tonight, they would hit Nui Dat hard, overwhelm the defenses, kill as many Australians as possible, and disappear back into the jungle before dawn. It would be a propaganda victory, proof that even Western soldiers could be beaten in their own bases, proof that the revolution was winning. D Company walked right into their staging area. The Australian soldiers moved through rain that felt like walking under a waterfall. Water filled their eyes, ran down their necks, made their gear twice as heavy. The smell of wet vegetation mixed with the oil on their weapons and the sweat under their uniforms. Cicadas sang in the brief moments when the rain lessened. Then the downpour would start again and drown out everything. The sound was constant, like standing under a drum that never stopped beating. Young platoon commanders like Dave Sabin led sections through the rubber trees. Soldiers like Buick Beak carried the M60, finger near the trigger, ready for anything. Private soldiers, whose names would never be famous, walked through that plantation carrying the same fear and determination as everyone else. They had trained for this. British-style infantry tactics passed down through Australian military tradition, fire and movement, section-level coordination, aggressive patrolling. They were good at it, but nobody trains you to fight 2,000 enemy soldiers with only 108 men. That's not a battle. That's a suicide mission. The jungle around the plantation was thick with vegetation. Triple canopy forest where sunlight barely penetrated. Vines hung from trees. Thorns grabbed at uniforms. But the plantation itself was different, ordered, controlled. The rubber trees stood in their neat rows like a strange garden in the middle of chaos. The Vietnamese workers who tapped those trees for latex were gone now. War had emptied the plantation of civilians. Only soldiers remained. At 15:40 hours, the afternoon already dark from storm clouds, the first shots cracked through the rain. Sharp sounds that cut through the downpour. 11 platoon made contact. The lead section spotted enemy fighters and opened fire. Normal procedure. Make contact, assess the threat, call for support if needed. Then more shots. Many more. From the sides, from the front, from positions the Australians hadn't even seen yet. The radio erupted with voices. Contact, contact, multiple enemy, wait, more enemy. Christ, they're everywhere. 11 platoon had stumbled into the front edge of an army. The realization hit like cold water. This wasn't a small patrol of guerrillas. The volume of fire told the story. AK-47s barked from dozens of positions, then hundreds. The distinctive crack thump of Kalashnikov rifles echoed through the plantation. Bullets snapped past the Australian soldiers, thudding into rubber trees, kicking up mud. The trees shook as rounds impacted. Bark flew in chunks. Leaves and branches rained down. Major Smith grabbed the radio. His voice stayed calm, but his brain hissed. Quick math. Enemy fire coming from at least 3 directions. Volume suggests company strength. No, more than that. Multiple companies. This is big. This is very bad. He had been in combat before. He knew what normal contact sounded like. This was not normal. This was an ocean of gunfire. The conventional doctrine was clear. Make contact. Assess. Call for helicopter extraction. Get out. American units did it all the time. Nobody expected infantry to stand and fight when outnumbered. You called in the helicopters, pulled back, and let the artillery and airstrikes do the work. That was the modern way. That was how you kept casualties low and body counts high. But the monsoon had grounded the helicopters. The rain was too heavy, the clouds too low. Pilots couldn't see to fly. No extraction coming. Not now, maybe not for hours. Artillery support from Nui Dat was 4 kilometers away, right at the maximum range of the guns. In this rain, accuracy would be poor. The shells might miss by hundreds of meters. Radio communications were already breaking up. Static, washed out words. Messages had to be repeated 3 times to get through. Smith understood something else too. If D Company ran, if they broke contact and retreated, the enemy would follow, or worse, they would continue with their original plan. They would hit Nui Dat tonight. 1,000 Australians sleeping in tents would wake up to an army pouring through the perimeter. It would be a massacre. The base wasn't prepared for an assault of this size. The defenses were designed to stop small probing attacks, not a regimental assault. The decision formed in his mind even as more radio reports flooded in. Enemy strength estimated at hundreds. No, more than hundreds. Thousands. This was impossible. Every instinct screamed to pull back. Every rule said don't fight when outnumbered 20 to 1. But Smith gave the order that changed everything. D Company would hold, right here, right now. In this rubber plantation in the rain with only 108 men and their rifles, they would stop an army. Some soldiers heard that order and felt their stomachs drop. Others nodded grimly and checked their ammunition. A few looked at each other with wide eyes that said, "We're going to die here." But they all obeyed. They all stayed. Because that's what soldiers do when the orders come and the bullets fly. They stay. They fight. They trust their leaders and their training and each other. The rain kept falling. The enemy kept firing. And 108 Australian soldiers prepared to fight the battle of their lives against impossible odds in a rubber plantation that most of them had never heard of until that morning. The decision went against everything conventional warfare taught. Never fight. Outnumbered 20 to 1. Never stay when you can withdraw. Never give up mobility. But Major Smith looked at the map in his mind and did the math. If D Company ran, the enemy reached Nui Dat. If D Company held, they might buy enough time for the base to prepare. Might. It was a slim chance, but it was the only chance. The word spread through the platoons. "We're staying, hold your ground, dig in." The soldiers looked at each other through the rain. Some nodded, some looked scared. All of them checked their ammunition and got ready. Hands moved automatically through familiar motions. Check magazine, chamber round, test selector switch, count grenades. The rituals of preparation helped calm the fear. Smith made another decision that contradicted normal thinking. Instead of pulling his 3 platoons together into one defensive mass, he spread them out. 11. Platoon, 10 platoon, and 12 platoon formed 3 separate defensive positions in a rough circle about 200 meters across. Each platoon would fight independently. Each would support the others with overlapping fields of fire through the rubber tree rows. It was risky. If one platoon broke, the whole defense might collapse, but it was the only way to cover enough ground. American doctrine in 1966 favored concentration of force and rapid movement. Bring everyone together, call in massive firepower, then extract by helicopter. The Australians were doing the opposite, spreading out, digging in, preparing to hold ground. It felt wrong, it looked wrong on paper, but Smith trusted his instincts and his training. The rubber trees helped and hurt at the same time. The perfect rows created natural firing lanes. You could see straight down the rows for 50 meters, even in the rain. good for shooting. Clear fields of fire meant you could engage targets at distance, but those same rows gave the enemy clear paths to attack. They could charge right down those lanes toward the Australian positions. The trees offered some cover, but not much. A rubber tree trunk was only about a foot thick. Bullets punched through them easily. Each Australian section held about 50 meters of frontage with just 10 men. That's one man every 5 meters. Way too spread out by normal standards. But there was no choice. They spread out, found whatever cover they could behind trees and in small dips in the ground. Some soldiers scraped shallow fighting positions with their entrenching tools. The ground was too muddy to dig deep, but even a few inches of earth offered some protection. The M60 machine gun teams set up with 4,000 rounds of ammunition each. The belts lay coiled in the mud, ready to feed into the guns. Each belt held 100 rounds, 40 belts per gun. The gunners positioned their weapons to cover the most likely approaches. The assistant gunners laid out the ammunition where they could reach it quickly. In a heavy firefight, an M60 could burn through 1,000 rounds in minutes. They had enough for maybe 10 or 15 minutes of sustained fire. After that, they would be out. Each rifleman carried 100 rounds for his SLR, 20 magazines of 5 rounds each. The SLR was a heavy rifle but accurate and powerful. It fired a full-sized rifle cartridge that could punch through cover and drop a man at 400 meters. But 20 magazines didn't last long in combat. In a normal firefight, that was plenty. In what was coming, it might last 10 minutes. Maybe less if the enemy really pressed them. The training kicked in now. Australian soldiers learned fire discipline from day one. Aimed shots, not spray and pray. Pick your target, squeeze the trigger, make every bullet count. Unlike American M16s that fired on full automatic, the SLR was semi-automatic only. One trigger pull, one shot. That forced discipline. That made soldiers aim instead of just hosing down an area with bullets. They also trained on something American units rarely practiced: danger-close artillery. Bringing shells down within 100 meters of your own position, sometimes 50 meters, sometimes closer. That required trust. Trust in your forward observer to get the coordinates right. Trust in the artillery crews to aim true. Trust that you wouldn't die from your own shells. American safety rules said keep artillery 300 meters away from friendly troops. That was the minimum safe distance. Anything closer risked killing your own men with shrapnel. The Australians trained to violate that rule when necessary. When you're surrounded and outnumbered, you bring the shells in close. Real close. Close enough to feel the blast. Close enough to risk dying from your own artillery. Because if you don't, you die anyway from enemy bullets. Forward observer. Maurice Stanley had the most important job on the battlefield. He would call in the artillery strikes from Nui Dat. 6 105-pointed howitzers sat 4 kilometers away, their crews waiting for fire missions. Stanley carried maps, a SAR, radio, and years of training. His voice would guide those shells. His calculations would mean life or death. One wrong number and he could drop artillery on his own men. One mistake and people died. The pressure was enormous, but Stanley was good at his job. The best. The philosophy difference was stark. American units relied on firepower superiority. More bullets, more bombs, more helicopters. Overwhelm the enemy and then leave. Mobility was key. Hit fast, hit hard, then get out before the enemy could respond. That worked when you had helicopter support. That worked when you could call in airstrikes. That worked when you fought on your terms. Australian doctrine emphasized holding ground, coordinated fire, artillery integration, fighting like their grandfathers did in World War II and Korea. Old-fashioned infantry combat where you picked a piece of ground and refused to let anyone take it. You dug in, you established fields of fire. You coordinated with artillery and machine guns. You made the enemy come to you, then you killed them when they did. It was slower, more methodical, but it worked when you couldn't rely on helicopters or air support. The enemy came in waves. The first attack hit 11 platoon at 16:08 hours. 300 Viet Cong fighters charged through the rubber trees, screaming battle cries meant to terrify. They expected the Australians to break, to panic like most Western soldiers did when facing such overwhelming numbers. The Australians opened fire with disciplined volleys. The SLRs barked in steady rhythm. Aimed shots, pick your target, fire, pick another, fire, not panic fire, not random shooting. Each soldier chose his target, aimed, and pulled the trigger. The M60 machine guns opened up with long bursts. The ripping sound of belt-fed weapons on full automatic. Traces zipped through the rain, bright streaks that marked the path of bullets. 600 rounds per minute pouring down those firing lanes. The rubber trees exploded into splinters as thousands of bullets tore through them. Wood chips flew through the air. Bark peeled away in chunks. Sap oozed from the wounds in the trees. The enemy kept coming, kept charging. Some fell, shot through the chest or head. Others stumbled but got back up, stepped over their own dead and kept attacking. The will to fight was incredible. These weren't untrained peasants. These were soldiers who believed in their cause. But the Australian fire didn't slacken. The M60 barrels glowed red hot even in the rain. Steam rose from the guns as rain hit the superheated metal. Gunners burned their hands on the metal but kept firing. The smell of cordite mixed with rain and mud. Smoke drifted through the plantation, adding to the reduced visibility. The noise was incredible. Continuous gunfire, explosions, screaming. The rain adding a constant roar under everything. The first wave broke. The enemy pulled back, leaving bodies piled in the firing lanes. Some of those bodies weren't dead yet. They crawled. They moaned. They called out in Vietnamese, crying for their friends or their mothers. The Australians held their fire, waiting for the next wave. Saving ammunition. Every bullet mattered now. Every round had to count. At 16:40 hours, Stanley called in the first artillery mission. He spoke calmly into his radio, giving coordinates, grid references, distance, direction. The words were technical, but their meaning was simple. Drop explosives on these enemy soldiers. The guns at Nui Dat boomed. The crews worked fast, loading shells and firing as quickly as possible. Seconds later, shells screamed overhead. The sound was distinctive, a freight train roar that grew louder as the shells approached. The first rounds landed 200 meters out, massive explosions that threw up geysers of mud and debris. Stanley watched through binoculars, judging the fall of shot. He spoke into his radio again. Adjust. Fire. Drop 100 meters. The next volley landed closer. He walked them in methodically. 150 meters. 100 meters. The ground shook with each explosion. Trees snapped like matchsticks under the blast. The explosions marched closer to the Australian positions like a walking giant. The second wave hit at 17:15 hours. Bigger this time, more soldiers. They learned from the first attack. Instead of charging straight, they used fire and movement. Some attacked while others gave covering fire. Professional tactics. These weren't untrained guerrillas running blindly. These were soldiers who knew their business. They moved in rushes, using the rubber trees for cover, firing as they advanced. 11 platoon nearly broke. The enemy got within 10 meters of their position, close enough to see faces, close enough to see the fear and determination in enemy eyes, close enough to throw grenades. Australian soldiers fixed bayonets, ready for hand-to-hand fighting. This was the moment. Hold or die. No middle ground. Stanley made a decision that saved them. He called artillery to 50 meters from the Australian positions. 50 meters. That's half a football field. That's nothing in artillery terms. The crews at Nui Dat hesitated for a second. Did he really mean 50 meters? Stanley confirmed. 50 meters. Fire for effect. The shells came down like thunder from God. The ground erupted. Dirt and shrapnel flew everywhere. Trees snapped. Branches flew through the air like spears. The blast wave knocked men down on both sides. Some Australian soldiers took shrapnel from their own artillery, small fragments that cut faces and hands. One soldier got knocked unconscious by the concussion. But it worked. The enemy attack shattered under the barrage. Bodies flew through the air. Limbs separated from torsos. The survivors ran back into the plantation, abandoning their assault. The artillery had broken them where rifle fire hadn't. The feeling was wrong. Every instinct said, run, call for extraction, get out while you can. The enemy would come again, in greater numbers, with better tactics. Staying here was suicide, but running meant death too. Running meant abandoning the base. Running meant letting 2,000 enemy soldiers reach your friends while they slept. So the Australians stayed. They reloaded. They checked their ammunition. They bound up wounds. They waited for the next attack. At 17:30 hours, the ammunition count got scary. Some sections were down to 10 rounds per man. 10 rounds, that's 2 magazines. That's maybe 2 minutes of fighting if the enemy came hard. The M60 teams were sharing ammunition belts, splitting them between guns. If the enemy came again in strength, they might not have enough bullets to stop them. The math was simple and terrifying. Stanley called for continuous artillery fire. Every gun at Nui Dat. Keep shooting. Don't stop. Over the next hour, those 6 howitzers fired more than 3,000 shells. The gun crews worked until their hands bled, loading, firing, loading, firing. The barrels got so hot they glowed orange. The crews poured water on them between shots to cool them down. Shell casings piled up around the guns like brass mountains. The enemy changed tactics. At 1800 hours, they stopped the human wave attacks. They had learned. Mass attacks weren't working against disciplined fire and artillery. Instead, they tried to infiltrate. Small groups sneaking through the gaps between Australian platoons. Moving quiet, using the rain and smoke as cover. Trying to get behind the defenders. If they could get into the rear, they could roll up the whole defensive line. Australian section commanders had trained for this. They held fire until the enemy was 15 or 20 meters away. Patience was hard when you could see enemy soldiers creeping toward you. Every instinct said, shoot now, but they waited. Let them get close. Then they opened up with coordinated volleys. Devastating ambushes at point-blank range. 10 rifles firing at once into a group of soldiers at 20 meters. The infiltrators never made it through, but it was close, so close. A few more meters and they would have succeeded. Everyone listened for one sound, the roar of engines. At 18:30 hours, they heard it. Armored personnel carriers from 3 Troop breaking through with ammunition resupply. The sound of those diesel engines was the most beautiful thing the soldiers had ever heard. The APCs crashed through the plantation, their tracks chewing up the mud, their machine guns covering the approaches. The APCs couldn't extract anyone. The battle was still too hot. Enemy fire was still too heavy. But they brought bullets. Beautiful, precious bullets. The soldiers grabbed the ammunition boxes and loaded fresh magazines. Their hands shook from fatigue and adrenaline, but they loaded fast. The M60 teams got new belts. They had a chance now. They could keep fighting. The rain never stopped. The ground turned to soup. Wounded men lay in water, their blood mixing with mud, turning it pink. Medics crawled through fire to reach them, dragging them back to covered positions, bandaging wounds with shaking hands, giving morphine shots, whispering encouragement. The smell was terrible: cordite, blood, wet earth, vomit. Fear has a smell too, though nobody talks about it. A sharp, acrid smell that comes from bodies under extreme stress. Darkness came early under the storm clouds. By 1845 hours, the plantation was black except for flashes of gunfire and the flickering light of artillery illumination rounds. Stanley called for illumination missions, special shells that burst high in the sky, releasing bright flares that drifted down on parachutes. The lights swung back and forth as the flares descended, casting wild shadows through the rubber trees. Everything looked like a nightmare. Shapes moved in the darkness. Trees became monsters. Every shadow could be an enemy soldier. The mind played tricks when you were exhausted and scared and trying to see threats in the dark. The Viet Cong launched their final assault as night fell. This was it. Everything they had left. All their remaining strength thrown at the Australian positions. All 3 Australian platoons came under attack simultaneously. The enemy had learned. They coordinated. They hit from multiple directions at once. They used the darkness to conceal their approach. They knew this was their last chance before Australian reinforcements arrived in strength. The base at Nui Dat was surely sending help by now. The noise became something beyond sound. It was pressure, a physical force that pressed against your eardrums and made your whole head throb. The crack of rifles, the thump of grenades, the roar of M60s, the scream of artillery shells overhead, the blast of explosions, the cries of wounded and dying men. All of it mixed into one continuous roar that made your ears ring and your head pound. Soldiers couldn't hear radio communications over the din. They shouted to each other and still couldn't be heard. Hand signals in the darkness, pointing, gesturing, trying to coordinate through chaos. At 11 platoon, a young conscript's rifle jammed, mud in the action. His hands shook as he tried to clear it. Enemy soldiers were 30 meters away and coming fast, their silhouettes visible in the muzzle flashes. He pulled the charging handle, slammed it forward. The bolt wouldn't move, stuck. His section commander fired beside him, buying him seconds. The conscript's hands were slippery with rain and fear and mud. He got the bolt open somehow, cleared the mud, slammed it home with his palm. The rifle fired. He picked a target and squeezed the trigger. The soldier fell. He picked another target. The fear transformed into something else. Not courage exactly, more like mechanical function. Body taken over when the mind couldn't process anymore. At 10 platoon, Buick Beek's M60 cooked off. The barrel was so hot from continuous fire that a round ignited in the chamber without. Him pulling the trigger. Cooking off. The gun fired by itself until the belt ran out. Uncontrolled. Dangerous. Beek's hands were burned through his gloves from touching the barrel. The skin blistered and peeled, but there was no time to stop. No time for pain. He loaded a new belt with burned hands, kept firing. The gun was too hot to aim properly. The barrel drooped slightly from the heat. He just pointed in the general direction of the enemy and held the trigger. The tracers drew lines through the darkness. 1 in 5 rounds was a tracer, so you could see where the bullets went. Red streaks cutting through the night. The enemy was close now, 20 meters, 15. You could see their faces in the muzzle flashes. Young faces, determined faces, scared faces just like the Australian faces. War makes everyone look the same when you're close enough. Fear and determination look identical on Vietnamese and Australian faces. They threw grenades. The Australians threw grenades back. The explosions lit up the night in orange flashes. Shrapnel pinged off trees and equipment. A soldier screamed as fragments tore into his leg. Stanley brought the artillery even closer, 30 meters from Australian positions. The safety officers back at Nui Dat would have said no. Impossible. Too dangerous. You'll kill your own men. Stanley did it anyway. He had to. The enemy was too close. The shells came down like the end of the world. The blast waves knocked men flat on their backs. Dirt rained down on everyone, getting in mouths and eyes. Trees snapped like toothpicks. Whole trunks falling across fighting positions. The concussion made your chest hurt and your vision blur. Some soldiers' noses bled from the pressure change, but it worked. The enemy attack broke apart under the barrage. Bodies flew through the air like rag dolls. Limbs separated. The survivors pulled back again. The pressure eased. The fire slackened. For a moment, there was almost silence. Just the rain. Just the ringing in everyone's ears. Just the moans of the wounded. The sudden quiet was almost as shocking as the noise had been. At 12 Platoon, Corporal Jack Kirby organized his section's defense despite being wounded. Shrapnel in his leg. A fragment about the size of a thumb lodged in his thigh muscle, bleeding through his uniform. The fabric stuck to the wound. He refused to be evacuated. His men needed him. The medic wanted to pull him back, but Kirby waved him off. He crawled from position to position, checking ammunition, repositioning soldiers, encouraging them. His voice stayed steady, even though he had to grit his teeth against the pain. Every movement sent fire through his leg. Leadership is what you do when everything is falling apart. Leadership is staying calm when your body screams at you to panic. Private Errol Nowak was 21 years old. He had a girlfriend back home named Jean. They had plans to get married after his tour. She sent him letters every week. He kept them in a plastic bag in his pack to protect them from the rain. At 18:55 hours, he saw enemy soldiers flanking his section. They were moving through a gap in the defensive line. If they got through, the whole position would collapse. The platoon would be surrounded. Everyone would die. Nowak stood up, fully exposed, drew their fire while his mates repositioned. He fired his SLR from the hip, not aimed shots now, just volume, trying to make them focus on him instead of his friends. Methodical shots, 1, 2, 3. An enemy bullet hit him in the chest. The impact spun him around. He fell. His section held their position, returned fire, killed the enemy soldiers. The gap closed. The line held. But Nowak didn't get up. His mates crawled to him, called for a medic. But there was nothing to do. He was gone. 21 years old. Jean would get a telegram in a week. The wedding would never happen. Major Smith stood at his command post, making impossible decisions. 11 platoon needed reinforcement. They were barely holding. 10 platoon needed ammunition, running low again despite the resupply. 12 platoon had wounded who needed evacuation. Kirby was still fighting but losing blood. He had no reserves, no extra men. Every soldier was already in the fight. There was nobody left to send. He made the call. 11. Platoon gets priority. They're closest to being overrun. If they break, everyone breaks. He sent his last 6 men, his headquarters element, radio operators, runners. The men who normally stayed safe at the command post. That's all he had left. 6 men to reinforce a platoon being hit by hundreds of enemy soldiers. The math was ridiculous, but there was no choice. The enemy made one more push at 1900 hours. Not a wave this time, just pressure. Probing attacks, testing for weak points, looking for any section that was low on ammunition or had too many casualties. Trying to find the break point. The Australian fire met them at every point. The M60s still ripped. The barrels glowing in the darkness like iron in a forge. The rifles still barked. The artillery still fell. There were no weak points. Just 108 men who refused to move. Men who had decided somewhere in the chaos that they would die here before they ran. And then, as suddenly as it started, the battle ended. The enemy fire stopped. The jungle swallowed the Viet Cong soldiers as fast as they had appeared. One moment there were thousands of enemy fighters, traces flying, explosions lighting the darkness. The next moment, nothing. Just rain and darkness and the moans of the wounded. The silence was eerie. After hours of continuous noise, the sudden quiet felt wrong. The Australians held their fire, fingers on triggers, eyes straining in the darkness. They waited. Nothing. Radio reports came in. Contact lost. Enemy withdrawn. All positions holding. Nobody could quite believe it. Against odds that should have killed them all, they had survived. The battlefield looked like hell. Bodies everywhere. Piled in the firing lanes where the first attacks came. Sprawled behind trees where soldiers had been caught by machine gun fire. Lying in craters where artillery had found them. Most of them were enemy soldiers. The rain washed over them, pooling in the craters, mixing with blood. The smell of death mixed with cordite and wet earth. The rubber trees stood like broken teeth, torn by bullets and shrapnel. Many had fallen. Others stood splintered and dying, their trunks shredded by thousands of rounds. Australian casualties were heavy. 18 men dead, 24 wounded. Out of 108 soldiers, that's nearly 40%. In some sections, half the men were casualties. But they held. They didn't break. Every platoon maintained its position. Every section kept fighting until the enemy withdrew. The defensive line never collapsed. Enemy casualties were devastating. At least 245 bodies were found on the battlefield in the immediate aftermath. Conservative estimate. Only counting bodies that could be confirmed and photographed. The real number was probably 2 or 3 times higher. Wounded carried away. Dead left in the jungle where nobody would find them. Blood trails leading into the darkness suggested many more casualties. The kill ratio was at least 14-1, possibly as high as 28-1. D Company had faced an army and destroyed it. After the battle, captured enemy documents told the story from the other side. The 275th Regiment called Long Tan a catastrophic defeat. Their planning was meticulous. Their intelligence was good. They knew Australian strength and dispositions. They expected to overrun weak Australian forces. They had done it before to other units, American units, South Vietnamese units, units that broke under pressure and called for extraction. But they met disciplined fire they couldn't break. They met artillery that came closer than any artillery should. They met men who wouldn't run. The enemy reports described the shock of it, the confusion. They expected the Australians to withdraw after the first heavy contact, standard Western tactics, but the Australians stayed. They dug in. They brought in artillery danger close. The enemy had never faced anything like it. The human cost was more than numbers. Young men who would never go home. Soldiers who would wake up screaming for decades. Memories that would never fade. Nowak's girlfriend, Jean, received a telegram 2 weeks later. She was at work when they delivered it. She collapsed when she read it. Kirby would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. The shrapnel in his leg couldn't be fully removed. It worked its way toward the surface over the years, causing pain. He would reach down and feel it under the skin sometimes. The survivors would gather every year on August 18th and remember. Fewer each year as time does what bullets couldn't. They remember faces, friends who stayed young forever while they grew old. They remember the sounds, the rain, the guns, the screams. They remember the smell, cordite, and blood and fear. They remember being 20 years old and terrified and brave at the same time. They remember proving that courage and skill could overcome impossible odds. They remember that it didn't matter in the end. The Viet Cong learned their lesson. They never attempted mass attacks against Australian forces in Phuoc Tuy province again. They shifted to small unit ambushes. Hit and run. They avoided set-piece battles where Australian firepower and discipline could devastate them. Enemy intelligence documents captured later warned fighters to avoid direct confrontation with Australian units. They called them the jungle ghosts who don't run. Fear is a teacher, and Long Tan taught the Viet Cong to fear these men. But halfway around the world in Washington, a different kind of battle was beginning. One fought not with bullets, but with lies about who deserved the credit. September 1966, Washington, D.C., the Pentagon. Briefing room where generals stood before maps and presented war progress to politicians. The room was elegant, wood paneling, large maps on the walls showing Southeast Asia, troop positions marked with colored pins. American generals in crisp uniforms with rows of medals took their turns presenting successful operations in what they called 3 Corps. They talked about body counts and kill ratios and territory secured. The language was clinical, detached, numbers instead of people. They presented Long Tan as evidence that American tactical doctrine was working. Aggressive patrolling was finding the enemy. Superior firepower was destroying them. The strategy was sound. Look at the results. Hundreds of enemy killed. Minimal friendly casualties. A decisive victory. The kind of victory that proved the war was winnable. The kind that justified the strategy and the ongoing commitment of American forces. President Lyndon Johnson listened. He wanted good news, needed it. The American public was getting restless about the war. College campuses erupted in protests. Young men were burning draft cards. Casualty lists were getting longer every week. Gold Star mothers were asking why their sons had to die in a jungle on the other side of the world. He needed victories to point to, proof that American boys weren't dying for nothing. Long Tan sounded like a victory. American forces and their allies had killed hundreds of enemy soldiers while taking minimal friendly casualties. The numbers looked good on paper. The kill ratio was outstanding, better than most American operations. This was the kind of success story that could be sold to the public. Evidence that aggressive tactics and superior firepower were working. But the truth had a way of coming out. Australian Prime Minister Harold Holt visited Washington that month. During a private conversation with President-elect Richard Nixon, the real story of Long Tan emerged. Holt was proud of his soldiers. Rightfully so. They had done something extraordinary. He told Nixon what really happened in that rubber plantation. Not American tactics, not American soldiers, not American doctrine. 108 Australian infantry using British Commonwealth doctrine, fighting in a way that contradicted everything American mobile warfare taught, holding ground instead of maintaining mobility, using danger-close artillery instead of maintaining safe distances, employing fire discipline instead of volume fire, small unit independence instead of centralized control. Everything the Americans said not to do. Nixon was sharp, sharper than people gave him credit for. He understood warfare better than most politicians. He had served in World War II as a Navy officer. He studied military history. He knew the difference between tactics and strategy. When he heard the truth about Long Tan, he saw immediately what the generals missed. The tactical victory proved the strategic failure. What Nixon said wasn't recorded in official transcripts. No stenographer took notes, but people who were there remembered. The words were said in private, but they spread. Nixon looked at the American generals who had been taking credit and said something like this: "Your boys held their ground when ours would have called in the helicopters and left. There's a lesson there we're not learning." The generals went silent. Nobody had a response. What could they say? The facts were undeniable. Long Tan was an Australian victory using Australian tactics. American units in the same situation would have called for extraction. That was doctrine. That was standard procedure. Maintain mobility. Don't get pinned down. Use firepower and helicopters to maintain the initiative. But the Australians proved that sometimes holding ground worked better. Sometimes refusing to yield was the right answer. Sometimes old-fashioned infantry tactics beat modern mobile warfare. The lesson was obvious to anyone willing to see it, but seeing it meant admitting that American doctrine might be wrong, that billions of dollars in helicopters and air support might not be the answer, that Vietnam might require different thinking. The tragic irony was obvious to anyone willing to see it. D Company proved that small unit excellence could defeat larger forces. Fire discipline beat volume of fire. One aimed shot was worth 10 spray and pray rounds. Artillery integration beat raw firepower. Calling shells in close and trusting your forward observer worked better than dropping bombs from a safe distance. Holding ground beat mobility when the situation required it. Sometimes you had to stand and fight instead of running. Everything the Australians did right contradicted American doctrine, but the American military was too big, too committed to change course. The machine had momentum, strategies had been set, equipment had been purchased, training programs established, command structures built around certain assumptions. Changing course would mean admitting mistakes, admitting that the entire approach might be flawed. Some units learned. Special forces studied Australian tactics. They sent observers to train with Australian units. They adopted some patrol techniques, small unit tactics, noise discipline, the art of moving through jungle without being detected. Marine units changed some procedures. Emphasis on marksmanship instead of spray. The 173rd Airborne adopted some Australian patrolling methods, but institutional resistance was massive. The spread of tactics was uneven and political. Units that tried to adopt Australian methods faced resistance from higher command. Why are you doing it differently? This isn't doctrine. This isn't how we train. The emphasis on body counts and search and destroy operations continued. Mobility and firepower remained the preferred approach. The Australians were praised in official statements but not copied in practice. Their methods were studied in classified reports but not implemented in training. Innovation died in the bureaucracy. Reports were written, lessons learned, documents filed, and then forgotten. The machine kept rolling. The strategy didn't change. More young Americans went to Vietnam trained in mobile warfare tactics that the Australians had proven were flawed for jungle counterinsurgency. Long-term impact on enemy operations was significant in one province, but meaningless to the larger war. The 275th Regiment was combat ineffective for 6 months after Long Tan. They had to rebuild, retrain, replace losses. New soldiers had to be recruited and brought south down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Officers had to be replaced. Morale had to be restored. Enemy intelligence documents warned troops to avoid Australian free fire zones. Specific grid coordinates to stay away from. Viet Cong fighters developed genuine fear of Australian units. They called them the jungle ghosts who don't run. They told stories about the Australians, how they moved silently through the jungle, how their fire discipline was devastating, how they brought artillery so close it killed attackers and defenders alike. The fear was real and it changed enemy behavior in Phuoc Toi province. But Vietnam was bigger than one province, much bigger. The enemy adapted everywhere else. They continued operations in other areas. They learned from their defeat but didn't surrender because of it. They adjusted their tactics. They avoided massed attacks. They went back to small unit ambushes and guerrilla warfare. The war continued. Americans died. Vietnamese died. The numbers kept climbing. Major Harry Smith received the Military Cross for his leadership at Long Tan, a prestigious award, well-deserved. But many argued he deserved the Victoria Cross, the highest award for valor in the British Commonwealth. The VC was rarely given, reserved for extraordinary courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Long Tan seemed to qualify, but Smith didn't get it. Some say because Long Tan embarrassed American commanders who had claimed credit for the victory. Politics and pride got in the way of recognition. Others say because the Australian military leadership didn't want to highlight how different Australian tactics were from American ones. Alliance politics, diplomatic considerations. Whatever the reason, Smith got the lesser award. He didn't complain. That wasn't his style. He continued serving until 1976, never achieving the rank his tactical brilliance deserved. He died in 1992, respected by those who knew, but forgotten by those who didn't. Many D Company veterans suffered for decades after, nightmares that never stopped. Waking up screaming, seeing rubber trees and muzzle flashes, flashbacks triggered by thunder or fireworks. The sounds, the smells, the faces of dead friends. What we now call post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't well understood in the 1960s and 70s. The soldiers were told to tough it out. Be strong. Don't talk about it. Real men don't cry about combat. Many turned to alcohol, to sleep, to forget. Marriages failed. Jobs were lost. Some ended their own lives years after surviving the battle. The Australian government was slow to provide help. The veterans felt abandoned by the country they had served. Vietnam was an unpopular war. The veterans came home to protests instead of parades, called baby killers and warmongers. They learned to hide their service, to never mention Vietnam. Only in the 1990s did recognition finally come, too late for many who had already died waiting for it. So Statistical vindication came slowly but surely. Australian forces in Phuoc Toi province from 1966 to 1971 maintained an 18-to-1 kill ratio, better than any comparable American unit operating in similar terrain. The numbers were undeniable. Casualty rates were 60% lower than American units. Fewer Australians died per engagement, fewer wounded per operation. Intelligence gathered from Australian operations was considered superior because they emphasized prolonged observation instead of quick, search and destroy sweeps. Australian patrols would watch an area for days before engaging. They gathered intelligence, identified enemy patterns, then struck precisely. American sweeps tended to be quick and loud. The enemy heard them coming and disappeared. The numbers proved Australian methods worked better for counterinsurgency. But here's the paradox that breaks your heart. D Company's tactical perfection couldn't change strategic reality. They fought a flawless battle, made all the right decisions, showed incredible courage and skill, proved that superior tactics and leadership could overcome overwhelming odds. And it meant nothing to the outcome of the war. The Viet Cong learned to avoid Australian forces, but continued operations elsewhere. They fought a different kind of war in a different way. American strategy of attrition and body counts was fundamentally flawed. The enemy could replace losses faster than Americans could kill them. The Ho Chi Minh Trail kept running. North Vietnam kept sending troops south. The will to fight never broke, no matter how many battles they lost. Long Tan proved you could kill the enemy 20-to-1 and still not win the war. You could fight perfectly and still lose, because the war itself didn't make sense. The strategy was flawed. The objective was unclear. The enemy had time and will that numbers couldn't measure. All the tactical excellence in the world couldn't fix strategic incoherence. The bitter lesson was proven but never learned. Small unit excellence works, fire discipline works, intelligent use of combined arms works, courage and leadership work. All of it was proven in that rubber plantation on August 18, 1966. But strategic incoherence, political constraints, and an enemy with unlimited patience made tactical victories meaningless. You can win every fight and still lose the war when the war itself doesn't make sense. Modern military doctrine shows some learning happened eventually. Australian Long Tan tactics influenced United States special operations development in the 1980s and 1990s. The emphasis on small unit autonomy appeared in Ranger training, squads operating independently, making decisions at the lowest level. Danger close artillery became standard practice for special forces. SEALs trained to call in fire support within meters of their positions. Disciplined fire instead of volume fire became doctrine for elite units. Iraq and Afghanistan saw revival of whole ground doctrine instead of Vietnam's mobility obsession. Small outposts, defend in place, know your area, build relationships with locals. The lessons took 20 years to sink in, passing through a generation of officers who remembered Vietnam's failures, but they did sink in for some units. The Army and Marines learned, slowly, painfully, at great cost. The rubber plantation at Long Tan is quiet now. Farmers work the red soil where artillery once churned the earth into hell. They plant crops and ground fertilized by old violence and blood. Occasionally, they find shell casings corroded by decades of rain, green with age, M60 links turned to rust, fragments of equipment buried in the mud. Sometimes they find bones. The rubber trees have grown over the fighting positions. New trees replace the ones torn apart by bullets and shrapnel. Nature heals what humans destroy given enough time. The plantation looks peaceful now. Birds sing. The rain still falls, but it's just rain, not the backdrop to violence, just water nurturing the earth. There's a small memorial at Long Tan now, a cross made of Australian wood, concrete and brass, a plaque with names, photos of young faces who stayed young forever while the world aged around them. Aging Australian veterans visit sometimes. Fewer each year as time does what the enemy couldn't. Their hair white now, bodies bent, but they stand straight at the memorial. They stand in the rain and remember. They remember friends who didn't come home, boys they knew for months or years who became part of them. They remember being 20 years old and terrified and brave at the same time, feeling immortal and mortal at once. They remember proving that courage and skill could overcome impossible odds. They remember that it didn't matter in the end. The war was lost anyway. Their friends died anyway. The lessons weren't learned anyway. Nixon understood what the generals refused to accept. Long Tan wasn't validation of the strategy. It was an indictment. The battle proved we could win tactically while losing strategically. It proved that individual heroism couldn't fix flawed policy. It proved that sometimes the victors don't even get credit for victories earned in blood and fear and rain. The jungle remembers. The rubber trees remember. The red earth remembers. History remembers for those willing to learn. 108 men proved everything about combat excellence and nothing about winning wars. That's the lesson Nixon saw, and the generals missed. That's what makes heroes weep decades later when they visit that memorial. That's what turns tactical brilliance into strategic tragedy. You can fight perfectly and still lose everything when the fight itself is wrong. You can kill the enemy 20-1 and still not win. You can do everything right and still fail because the mission itself was impossible. That's the truth that American generals couldn't face in 1966. That's the truth that Nixon understood. That's the truth that 108 Australian soldiers proved in blood on August 18th, 1966, in a rubber plantation nobody had heard of before that day. And that truth echoes still through every war fought since. Every perfect tactical victory achieved in pursuit of flawed strategy. Every soldier who did everything right and still lost. Every leader who understood the mission was wrong but followed orders anyway. Long Tan stands as proof that courage and skill aren't enough. That sometimes the bravest thing is admitting the war itself is the problem.